It. Before I forget, I want to tip my hat to Ray. I think I've made the last 2 or 3 days a living hell for him because I was trying to play the music and get the words at the same time was not an easy thing, and Ray pulled it off, so I have to tip my hat to him. I don't know if this would be a good idea, but I've always wondered if in our name badges, in addition to having our names, we would have something about our philosophical or religious, spiritual identification. And I guess I've already tipped my hand because if there was something under my name, it would be some sort of Buddhism. I was not raised a Buddhist. I was born into a pretty middle-class neighborhood. I was raised in the Methodist Church. And I have no ill feelings toward them. I actually had some very instructive experiences with them. But like a lot of teenagers, you get older and then you start becoming sullen and difficult. And for those of you who had teenagers, you know what I'm talking about. But I was one myself. And I started questioning things, and I eventually sort of grew out of not out of disrespect, but I sort of grew out of the Christian way of explaining how the world works, and I was attracted to Buddhism maybe just by default. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time, which is and was a very ecumenical kind of community. There's all kinds of people there. And in one particular instance, there was a guy named Alan Watts, and some of you may have heard of him. He used to have regular radio shows on the radio, and I used to listen to him all the time, and I thought this was very interesting. And he was probably not a good example to lead into Buddhism. I've heard many Buddhists say they don't understand him, and he was, even by Buddhist standards, he was pretty much of a rogue. But he was interesting, and I listened to his shows. I started reading books. I think I did a sermon about a year ago about Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. And the gist of that sermon was it's almost nothing about Zen. And there's a little bit of motorcycle maintenance, but not much Zen. There's another related book called The Zen of Archery. There's another book called The Way of Zen. And I read a lot of these. But to be perfectly candid, I don't think I was prepared at that time to put in the necessary effort that was going to be needed to appreciate the variety and complexity of Buddhism. There are many, many different forms of Buddhism, and at the very, very least, there are at least 3 broad divisions within the Buddhist community. There's the Mahayana, which is what you find in Japan and China. Zen is sort of a branch of Mahayana. There's the Theravada, which are the novices you see dressed in the orange robes, and they tend to live in monasteries. And there's the Vajrayana, which is pretty much a fusion of Tibetan natural beliefs and Buddhism. And then with all 3 of those branches, there are additional subgroups. So when somebody tells you what Buddhism is, be careful, because there's many different forms of Buddhism. There's a lot of terminology in Buddhism that I did and still find difficult. You'll hear things like the Dharma and the Karma, and there's reincarnation. After the Buddha's death, there was a lot of folklore added to his life that was certainly not in keeping with the message he wanted to leave behind. There's the Zen koans, and I think when I was younger, I was trying to be really cool and try to figure out the Zen koans. And one of them, like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? The whole point of the koans is they don't make sense, and you need to stop wasting your time trying to figure them out. But I was trying to figure them out anyway. That was sort of my initial experience with Buddhism. And there's a lot of terms that translate, I think, kind of awkwardly into English, and they sound kind of depressing. Like, one of the main issues, or one of the main premises of Buddhism, is that life is suffering. And that sounds really depressing when that's sort of your basic premise. That is one translation. There's some others as well that are not quite as depressing sounding. But there's a lot of other things like the not self, which I had a hard time understanding for a long time. But it all seemed kind of, not all, but a lot of it seemed kind of weird and depressing. And when I was a teenager, that was cool. But when I got older, I think I wanted to have a fuller understanding of what it all meant. And then the more I studied it, the more I realized, just how complicated Buddhism and its various forms are. My really quick elevator speech on the history of Buddhism, there probably was a man named Siddhartha Gautama who lived maybe in the ballpark of 400 or 500 years before the Common Era in what is today northern India or southern Nepal. He was born into a wealthy family, but he discovered there was a lot of misery and suffering in the world around him, and he kind of became disillusioned, and I'm sure the term had not been invented yet, but he was not satisfied with his kind of bourgeois environment, and he basically abandoned his wife and child and family and headed for the forest, where he hung out with other sort of itinerant spiritual seekers and wanted to figure it all out. After many trials and tribulations, the story has it that he became enlightened, like in a moment, while sitting underneath or meditating underneath a large Bodhi tree. After the enlightenment, his first sermon is said to have centered on what we now call the Four Noble Truths. And the truths are something like a hypothesis. This is what life is supposed to be about. And Buddhism is sometimes defined as the process of verifying these hypotheses. And the first of the Noble Truths is life is suffering. So that's, again, that could be another sermon. There's I think, a lighter interpretation of that, and won't get into that now. The second Noble Truth is the cause of suffering is desire, and sometimes that's translated as attachment to things, and that's going to come up in a little bit. The solution is to stop the attachment to things. And the fourth Noble Truth is, how are you going to do that? And then you go into what we call the Eightfold Path. And the first one is called right understanding, and that's kind of what I'm going to center on today. The Buddha left no written texts. In fact, he was probably illiterate. We shouldn't hold that against him because he lived in a time and place where the written language was just beginning to be in use. In fact, it's not even clear what language he may have spoken. The sutras we have today, in fact, I meant to tell you, the term sutra actually means thread. So in this case, it's a thread of ideas. And the memory that we have of the Buddha, in fact, the only record we have of the Buddha, were these sutras that were transmitted orally for almost 400 years before any of them are actually written down. Just to put this in context, sometimes when people talk about Christianity, the first book of Mark was written about 20 years after the death of Jesus. And people say, well, how could they know what happened 20 years before? They weren't there. In Buddha, we're talking about 20 years. We're talking 400 years. That's a long time to chant. And the reason I played the chant this morning was to try to recreate what this might have been like for these people to perpetuate, to carry on this tradition when there was no written language. So that's why even today, in the Buddhist, your chanting is a big part of their tradition. So 400 years. By the time they were written down, they were already, like any good religious tradition, they were already fighting amongst themselves about what the Buddha had said, and 400 years of chanting, who knows what changes may have come along in that time. So we start seeing divisions fairly early on within the Buddhist tradition. None of these original documents have survived. In fact, this is even more shocking. Today, the oldest surviving written Buddhist texts that we have are only about 500 years old. And the Buddha was living maybe roughly 2,500 years ago. So it's a really tenuous thread we have to the Buddha. So I mentioned Star Wars earlier to the children. To me, the Buddha, he seems to be coming to us, like in Star Wars, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But in a way, I find that touching because even in spite of this really thin thread that we have from this guy, he still seems to speak to people all over the world. And I continue to be moved by all the images, the statues and the paintings of the Buddha sitting in quiet meditation. With this preliminary information out of the way, I have to confess that I have deliberately misled you this morning about the title of my talk. The title was, and you wouldn't have, and I'll tell you why. The title of my talk is The Buddhist Essence of Unitarian Universalism, but it's not actually about essence, and I'll get to that in just a minute. And it has to do with this depressing thing that I didn't want to, like, oh no, he's talking about something really depressing, I'm not going to come. So it's a translational issue. So I'm going to begin my talk, and I'm going to tell you what essence is, but I'm going to tell you a story that demonstrates essence first. I'm kind of a teacher by trade, and I love to tell stories that show something rather than just tell them what it is. And it's a really weird story, and it's a true story, and it comes from World War II. And it concerns a German war criminal named Hermann Goering. And some of you may know who he was. He was a very prominent Nazi. In fact, he was probably second only to Adolf Hitler in the Nazi hierarchy till almost the very end. He was the original head of the SS before he passed it off to Heinrich Himmler. So he was not a very good guy. He had been a fighter pilot in World War I, and for that reason, and maybe the only reason, Hitler named him to be the leader of the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force. The good thing for us was Goering was not a very good administrator of the Luftwaffe, and as the Luftwaffe became increasingly ineffective during the war, he sort of had a falling out with Hitler, but he didn't let that prevent him from enjoying life. He was wealthy, he ate well, and he drank well, and one of his hobbies was art collection. And it turned out that he had collected quite a vast art collection during the war. After the war was over, he's arrested and put on trial at the Nuremberg trials. And they discover his art collection. And the Dutch authorities were particularly upset because amongst his art collection was a painting by Johannes Vermeer. And you art historians might know who he was. He's considered one of the greatest painters ever, definitely one of the greatest Dutch painters ever. And Goering had this painting in his collection, and it's Christ with a woman taken in adultery by Johannes Vermeer. Anyway, the Dutch were very upset that a Nazi war criminal had basically acquired what they considered to be a national treasure. And they wanted to know how Goering had come about it. And he gave them a name of a guy named Han van Meegeren. And so they arrest van Meegeren, and he's accused of collaboration with the enemy, which is not a small deal because that was punishable by firing squad. So van Meegeren goes on trial, but he's got a really interesting defense. And this is going to come back to Buddhism, believe me. He says, did you sell Goering this painting? He says, yes. And then he said, but it's not a Vermeer. And he said, what do you mean it's not a Vermeer? And he says, well, it's a fake. And they said, well, how do you know it's a fake? He said, because I painted it. And they said, there's no way you could have painted it. This is a Vermeer. It had been a recently discovered Vermeer, but had been authenticated by all the leading art dealers and historians in Europe, and it was a real artistic coup that they had found these. So van Meegeren says, I'll tell you what, I'll prove it. So they literally, in his jail cell, gave him another easel and some paints, and he said, I'll paint you some more Vermeers. So sure enough, I think, is there a next picture here? There he is, standing in front of another easel, knocking out another Vermeer. So the irony was that van Meegeren goes from being a collaborator to actually a national hero because he had built Goering out of the Vermeer painting. But and I'm going to get back to Buddhism now. And this is, the reason I'm telling you this story is because it has something to do with essence. And this is a quote that somebody wrote. They were with Goering when he was told that his Vermeer was actually a fake, and this is the quote. On being told his painting was a fake, an observer noted that Goering looked, and here's the quote, as if for the first time he had discovered there was evil in the world. So, better late than never for a Nazi war criminal. And I don't think Goering realized it, and I'm sure he wouldn't have appreciated it even if he had. But Goering had just received a lesson in what we call essence, and here's the title of the sermon, but there's a catch. I'm going to get to it. The name essence, I looked this up in the dictionary just to make sure I didn't get it wrong, is usually described as being an intrinsic character or an indispensable quality of something that determines its character. So it's fixed, it's unchangeable, it's locked in, it's something that exists unto itself and requires nothing else for its existence. So here was this famous Vermeer. It was very prestigious to have a Vermeer. Even Adolf Hitler had a Vermeer. You had to have a Vermeer if you were a Nazi, I guess. And Goering was very proud of it. But the moment he realized that it was not a Vermeer, suddenly this painting, which had not changed at all, lost its essence. But here's the catch. According to one of the Buddhist insights, the Buddhist said that things do not have essence. The painting did not have essence. They thought it had essence, but it did not. But it's not just a painting. It's everything, according to Buddhism. Things do not have intrinsic essence. One of the examples, and this is kind of a common example, but I think it'll also explain it, like a tree, for example. If you were to ask the Buddha, does a tree have essence? And he would say, no. Because in order for a tree to be a tree, it needs lots of other things. It needs soil to grow in. It needs nutrients in the soil. It needs water. It needs the right atmosphere. It needs sunlight from above. It needs to make sure it's not eaten by pests or cut down by people. A tree cannot exist by itself. And that's kind of an example of essence. So I was reading about this whole idea of essence, and then it got kind of weird for me because I'm just going about my everyday, things. I'm watching stuff on TV, I'm reading books, and then I started seeing this whole idea of essence. But what the real title of the sermon should have been is, there is no essence, and the way it's translated is that there's emptiness. But if I'd said the emptiness of whatever, people said, oh no, Kirk's on a rant, he's mad about something, and they're not going to come. But I'm doing some other stuff, and I'm saying, wait, that's emptiness. That's exactly what the Buddha said. And I have three kind of bizarre examples, and I'll see if I can go through these quickly. And the first one is Gregory Rasputin, and I read a novel about him. He was an interesting guy, and I'm just going to read something that came up at the beginning of the biography. This is what the biography wrote about him. A curious thing happened, however, as I was following the footsteps of this elusive real Rasputin. The deeper I went into my research, the more convinced I became that one of the most important facts about Rasputin, the thing that made him such an extraordinary and powerful figure, was less what he was doing and more about what everyone thought he was doing. So he basically came, and this was at the very beginning of the book, and I was always under the assumption that a biographer is supposed to get to the essence of a character, to find out what was really there and just get rid of all the extraneous stuff. And right off the bat, he says, I don't know what was really there, because what we know about Rasputin is really more about what people thought he was doing than what he may or may not have been doing, which we don't always know. So I'm reading this, and I said, wait a minute, that's essence, or that's emptiness. We don't really know what Rasputin was like. Another strange example, and some of you will, who's this? And this is a trivia history. Patty Hearst, what was her nom de guerre? Tanya. I watched a CNN documentary on Tanya. Patty Hearst, for those of you who don't know, was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the great publisher. She was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army and became Tanya. She was an urban guerrilla bent on tearing the government down, and she became an urban guerrilla until she got caught. And then she basically said, no, it was all a mistake. I was brainwashed. The whole Stockholm Syndrome issue came up. And she was actually convicted, didn't serve a lot of time, and then got out and kind of went back to being Patty Hearst again. And at the end of the documentary, there were a lot of people that found this whole story very disturbing because they said, who is she? Is she just the kind of rebellious teenage daughter of a rich guy? Or was she the revolutionary? Or did she just go back to kind of her rich, privileged life again? And there was the idea that this was very disconcerting, that we couldn't nail down what Patty actually was. And so I'm watching this and I said, wait a minute, that's emptiness again. There may not be an intrinsic Patty Hearst, because maybe she's all of these things, maybe she's none of these things. And lastly, and I'll move on, and this is my weird streak. This is the Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski, who was a PhD mathematician who suffered from mental illness. And he wrote this long diatribe about the evils of the industrial society, but it was what they came to realize, or at least their understanding, was that it was really just a reflection of his mental illness and the traumas he had suffered as a child and as a student at Harvard, of all places, where he was basically abused in a psychological experiment and probably caused a lot of emotional trauma. And it all came out with him just sending bombs to people he didn't know and thinking somehow that was going to change the world. So the idea of the world to Theodore Kaczynski didn't really have essence. He sort of made up this vision of what he thought was out there, but it really didn't have much to do with reality. So these were all just kind of strange examples of what I sort of stumbled into that I thought were examples of essence. A criticism of Buddhism in general, and emptiness in particular, is often that it's just some sort of weird postmodern radical relativism. If there's no real essence there, then it can just be kind of whatever you want it to be. It's all cool, it's all good. You don't have to worry about it. There are two things I think wrong with that criticism, and I'm not going to go into them, but I told you the first component of the Eightfold Path. There's 7 more, and all of them are actually a pretty specific laundry list that a true Buddhist is supposed to practice in order to prevent them becoming just sort of dissolving or kind of dwelling into some sort of weird narcissism. So there's right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness. It's pretty specific. Another criticism, and along these lines of it's just sort of this narcissistic relativism, I'm going to quote you a quick thing from Hamlet. And this is a scene where Hamlet is visited by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who are basically these two toadies for his uncle the king, and they're basically sent to spy for the king, but Hamlet's on to him. Anyway, here's the phrase. Here's Hamlet. What have you, my good friends, deserved at the hands of fortune that she sends you to prison hither? Guildenstern. Prison, my lord? And Hamlet. Denmark's a prison. And Rosencrantz. Then the world is one. And Hamlet says, a goodly one, in which there are many confines, wards, and dungeons, Denmark being one of the worst. Rosencrantz says, we think not so, my lord. And here's the punchline. This is Hamlet. Why, then, 'tis none to you, for there is nothing neither good or bad, but thinking makes it so. To me, it is a prison. So again, the two interpretations of this phrase are, if it's a prison, it's a prison. If it's not, it's not. You can think whatever you want about it, and that makes it the way it's supposed to be. But the more nuanced interpretation of this phrase is when Hamlet says it's a prison, he's actually demonstrating to us that he's a prisoner of his own thoughts. He's trapped in this really ugly story. His uncle has married his mother and killed his father. It's got some serious family issues going on. And he's really traumatized with this whole thing. And he's not seeing the world very clearly because of that. So the whole point was that I think both Shakespeare and the Buddha were onto the reality for all of us that we can become trapped by our ideas. I was hoping to leave you with just a few takeaways this morning. One is about this concept of the lack of essence, and hence the term emptiness. But more importantly, and I wanted you to maybe go away with this idea in your heads, that one of the premises of Buddhism is that it addresses our inability to see things very clearly. In our world today, I think, and I'm just going to go off the cuff now, it just seems like we have more and more polarization, more and more hatred, the more and more inability of people to talk to each other coherently without screaming over their heads. And I think this too is an example of essence. When we find somebody we disagree with, and this goes for liberals and conservatives and moderates, and regardless of your religious or philosophical interpretations, we tend to give essence to the people we disagree with. If I'm a liberal, which I am, but actually I'm more of a moderate. But if I disagree with a conservative, I tend to say, well, that is a conservative, and this is what a conservative is supposed to be. And those characteristics can never, ever be changed under any circumstances. And I think people probably do the same thing with me. Kirk's a moderate or liberal, and he has these characteristics that cannot be changed or altered under any circumstances. And I think that's exactly what the Buddha was trying to warn us against, that there is no essence in things. It's a lot of our misconceptions about how we look at other people, especially people we disagree with, and ideas and all the circumstances in our life. Here's a quote. You can safely assume, this is from Anne Lamott, you can safely assume you've created God in your image when it turns out that the God that you've created hates all the same people you do. I think that is essence. In my opinion, I think Buddhism is probably the only major spiritual tradition that cautions us about the limitations of how we can understand the world around us. And not to end on a depressing note, emptiness and suffering and not self. One of the other things that appeals to me about Buddhism, and it was mentioned in the sutra, the Buddha believed that he was not the first enlightened one. He did feel that he was enlightened, but he also felt that there would be more enlightened people after him. So then what that means is we could be enlightened, or our descendants could be enlightened. So there's hope, I think, in the world, because there's always a chance for improvement. And that's my message. Thanks for coming this morning and listening to me.